Great, so last story, a little bit different. It's not from my collection, but it's one that I had published quite recently in December. It's based on time I spent in boarding school. I did 10 years in boarding school in the West Country of England. This is the second boarding school, Malvern College. And at every age, all the time we were ever in boarding school, depending on our sophistication and our imagination, we found means to escape the confines of the institutions. And this story is a little bit of background on that. I chose this also because it seemed to me an interesting one, because the event was very mundane. I had an after lunch one day, probably in 1979, and it stuck in my mind for reasons that I couldn't really figure out. I never wrote it down, and I was thinking I really must do until the end of last year when I jotted it down and finally finished it. And it seemed to me there was an element of strange parallels and symmetry in this situation between two people of very different classes, very different ages, and very different experiences in history, and with one single common denominator, which is something we all think about at some point in our lives, which is waste. Waste not, want not. So I'll now read the final story, Glue. Dr. Ferguson stood surveying the dining room, waiting for complete silence. Raising his vast bushy eyebrows, his yellow eyes burning with passion, he cleared his throat. Gentlemen, today the senior house play number 4 in the semi-finals, junior house play number 6. I expect every boy not engaged in compulsory activities to attend the matches and give your support to the teams. 3 cheers for the senior house and the junior house. Huzzah! 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 We shouted, banging forks and knives, glasses, the cacophony merging into a steady, savage, tribal rhythm. He smiled, raising his hands, and the noise gradually died down. Gentlemen, you are dismissed. Tally-ho, let's keep the silverware. Number 7 never loses. He motioned towards the tremendous display of cups, trophies, and engraved plates arrayed behind him in the mahogany war memorial. Lists of the dead, gold against the black. More cheers and shouting as the rabble surged towards the changing rooms. I waited, letting them depart. I was off games with a broken wrist. Kick-off at 3 o'clock, I would make my way to the playing fields after a cigarette. Standing on the sidelines with the weeds and the milksops. Henderson patted me on the shoulder. Wish you were playing. Defense will be crap with Payer on the wing. We might be pushed today. I smiled. Thanks, yes, he's a ponce. Only in the team because Daddy's the school doctor, Henderson added. Big gangly woman. I laughed, wandering up the stairs, the noise and the foulness of the changing rooms below. The workmen had been redecorating the reading room, a pleasant smell of sawdust in the air. Hello, Mr. Rawlings, I said. A big, placid, friendly man, Mr. Rawlings was an awfully good chap. He'd even give me a cigarette now and then. I paid him back when we met at the fountain. Ah, lad, still in plaster, I see. How was your lunch then today? Rather awful, actually, I must say. The usual, you know, Mr. Rawlings. He stared, his head tilted, one eye much larger than the other. Now tell me then, young man, what did you have that was so awful then? We had the most dreadful beef and soggy vegetables, with a skin on the custard. Dreadful beef, you say? Dreadful beef? No doubt you had Yorkshire pudding too. Indeed, I agreed, but it was terribly dry. But you ate it up, though. Well, I must confess, I did leave some of the beef. There was some string, you see. Now look here, young man, let me tell you something. Initially, I thought he was joking, but to my astonishment, I realized Mr. Rawlings was quite angry. Gesticulating, he continued. After Normandy it was, we was pushing forwards. Jerry's had us all the time, edge row after edge row, no supplies for a couple of days. I was so hungry, I found an half-rotten potato in a field, emptied out the worms, and I ate that potato raw. Raw, you hear, raw. Now you telling me about you didn't like the beef and the custard, and you had Yorkshire pudding. While he was shouting, I noticed a large pot of glue in the bin at the back of the room. Evo stick, big red and white letters. I waited for him to calm down. And they use potatoes to make glue, Mr. Rawlings. By the way, do you need that tin of glue in the bin there? Hey? He glanced round. No, lad, you take it almost empty. It is. If you need it, pity the waste. But you hear what I say, like, don't you ever be complaining about good food, never. And no waste. Food is food, and taters especially, you hear? Yes, Mr. Rawlings. I picked the tin out of the basket. Thank you, Mr. Rawlings, and a jolly good day to you. See you at the fountain. We'll be down there this Saturday. He nodded. We'll be drinking some beer, right enough. Wandering along the wooden corridor towards the study, I opened the lid, pushing my finger onto the brown mass congealed at the bottom. Burying my face into the tin, I inhaled. Gagging, I stopped inhaling again, and I barged into the room. Lads, look what I've got.